Hello and welcome to my channel NB Soundtopper UK, and the subject of this video will be my ranking of the 8 Black Sabbath studio albums released between 1970 and 1978. From about 1976 to 1981, I was a pretty much committed fan of what's now regarded as classic rock. For a time, Black Sabbath were one of my favourite bands and one of the few where I had all of their studio albums, so these are albums I'm very familiar with. Anyone aware of the band's history will know the significance of the period I'm talking about, but if you don't, I'm covering the years up to the point where Ozzy Osbourne left the band. As I mentioned, this will be a ranking video, and if the ordering seems a little unusual, perhaps that's because my tastes have broadened a lot since 1981, and I probably now see qualities in some of the albums that I might not have appreciated had I remained a die-hard fan of classic rock to the virtual exclusion of all else. Anyway, on we go. At 8 is Technical Ecstasy from 1976. Curiously, this was the first Black Sabbath album I ever bought, so whether there's an element of familiarity breeding a smidgen of contempt in placing it eighth, I don't know. In hindsight, the area that I'm not enamoured with are the lyrics, which I find a little crap and cringy in places. Backstreet Kids, for instance. The idea of a band with a kind of drug habit they had by 1976 trying to identify with their fans in this way is a little embarrassing. With Dirty Women and Gypsy, the lyrics are dull cliches, really. The subjects of the lyrics were a little bit of a departure for the band and, on the whole, didn't really work. Nevertheless, it's an album I still like. Creditable performances from everyone in the band, and musically, the tracks are all solid. At 7th is Sabbath Bloody Sabbath from 1973. Elements of prog came into many Black Sabbath tracks, but Sabbath Bloody Sabbath I think of as their proggiest album. The only problem is that it feels a little bit clumsy here. A National Acrobat and Sabra Cadabra are both excellent tracks until you get to the shifts in tempo, which are a little awkward and forced. The use of synths doesn't help either, with Who Are You actually sounding a bit amateurish. Still, there are lots of positives. The title track, Killing Yourself to Live, and Looking for Today. I suppose in the end there's a shade too much prog about the album, and at times it's as though the band are overreaching themselves. Nothing wrong with being ambitious though, and they'd make a better job of it on one of their later albums. 6th is Master of Reality from 1971. The sludgy riff on Sweetleaf, the album's opener, is a real classic, and down the years you can hear the influence of this type of Black Sabbath track. For example, the tracks SO36 and The Hum, both by Killing Joke, spring to mind. The one downside to Sweetleaf is the middle section with its higher tempo, which serves as a device for guitarist Tony Iommi to indulge in a solo, but it adds very little else. Looking at the rest of the album, there is some fine stuff. After Forever, Children of the Grave, Into the Void, and Lord of This World all tick the box for heaviness, whereas Solitude is a little more reflective, and Orchid and Fluff pad things out. So why haven't I rated this album higher? Well, I think it's largely down to the production. Considering how heavy the music mostly is, to my ears, it's a touch too lo-fi, and there's a lack of spaciousness to the sound. I'm nitpicking, I guess, but my placement of all the albums is based on very fine margins. 5th is Volume 4 from 1972. I don't know the story behind the recording of this album, but there are times when it's as though the band may have been struggling to get an album's worth of material together. Wheels of Confusion sounds like the fragments of at least 3 or 4 tracks thrown together. Weirdly, it kind of works because the constituent parts aren't jarringly different in feel. Similarly, FX is something that may also have been a fragment, but is so far removed from anything they've done before or after, they maybe left it on the album simply for that fact. Mind you, since my days of being an out and out rocker, I've listened to quite a lot of experimental music, and I don't find FX the challenge that a lot of rock purists might. Aside from those tracks, there are some decent hard rockers on this album: Supernaut, Snowblind, and Cornucopia, to name but three. There is also the now well-known Changes, which is a bit overwrought, but otherwise okay, and then the very nice instrumental Laguna Sunrise. Fourth is Paranoid from 1970. Warpigs, Paranoid, Iron Man, Electric Funeral, and Hand of Doom are a quintet of tracks which set the tone for this album and dominate it, all with individual qualities, although in a few cases some weaknesses too. I'm not a great fan of vocalists simply following guitar lines, so when Ozzy Osbourne does it on Iron Man and Electric Funeral, it takes a little of the shine off of them. With Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, I referred to tracks with awkward transitions, and on this album, Hand of Doom falls into that category. Once again, I'm splitting hairs with these criticisms. The other three tracks, Planet Caravan, Rat Salad, and Fairies Wear Boots, are all pretty decent, but slightly overwhelmed by the other five. An excellent album, albeit with a lopsided feel to it. Third is Never Say Die from 1978. Their last album with Ozzy Osbourne in this era, and one which isn't generally well thought of. However, not being a dyed-in-the-wool classic rock fan, I look at the album from a different angle and consider it their most adventurous, with some pleasing results. Many of the tracks have a real shift in emphasis from what you get on earlier albums. A scratchier buzz in the guitar sound, particularly on Johnny Blade and Shockwave. The rhythm section leading from the front on Junior's Eyes. An almost sing-along track by way of A Hard Road. The dramatic breakout complete with brass and horns coming to the fore. The excellent final track, Swinging the Chain, sung by Bill Ward. And on Over to You, one of Ozzy Osbourne's finest performances, in my opinion. Some things don't work so well. The tacky synth opening to Johnny Blade and the dog's breakfast of a track that is Air Dance. Definitely not an album for purists, but as a response to the shifting landscape in rock music at the time, a fine effort. Number two, Black Sabbath from 1970. The epic opening title track is a real classic and a statement of intent defining what the band would be all about. At the same time, the album highlights some of the band's bluesier roots, but that doesn't detract. In fact, I think it adds charm. The track Evil Woman is, dare I say it, almost jaunty. Although Black Sabbath's guitar sound was not as original as some might like to believe, the songs themselves have a lot more focus and sense of direction than, say, the band High Tide, whose debut album Sea Shanties has a similar sound, but too many compositions meander into excessive jamming. Back to this album. There are no duds. Yes, there are tracks with transitions, but nothing falls flat, and my criticism of these sorts of tracks on later albums is due to them not being an improvement on what's on offer here. Excellent debut, and the deluxe edition with bonus disc is well worth getting. Number one, Sabotage from 1975. Don't judge a book, or, in this case, an album by its cover. Sabotage is a monster of an album and definitely one of my favourites in this genre. With Hole in the Sky gets off to a great start, a crunching riff, and from a songwriting perspective, the band committing to the track by not trying any fancy changes and transitions, proving that there are times when a straightforward approach is far more effective. The acoustic Don't Stop Too Late is a good bridge into Symptom of the Universe. This track and Megalomania have more complex arrangements, but unlike similar efforts on other albums, there seems to be greater attention to detail in making them work. Side 2 sees the addition of synth on Thrill of It All and the catchy Am I Going Insane radio, but it's used to complement the tracks. a major improvement on the poorer use of synth on Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. Superstar, complete with choir and drama. There's an excellent fade out on Am I Going Insane radio into the brooding start of the final track, The Writ. But this is the only track which doesn't quite deliver. It shifts around too much and barely settles down. Nevertheless, it doesn't put too much of a dampener on what would otherwise be a near perfect album. That's it then. In summary, I'd say that the output of this incarnation of the band has held up extremely well over time. After 1978, until I lost interest in classic rock in 1981, there were the two albums with Ronnie James Dio on vocals, but I'd rate these as okay at best. Up in the top left corner is the usual graphic encouraging some kind of feedback if you feel so inclined. Also, as per usual, I'll close by saying that if you've made it this far, thanks for watching.